I was born in San Francisco in Japantown, 1937. And when I was 4 years old, I was placed in San Francisco General Hospital because I had these ongoing earaches. And, you know, I grew up speaking Japanese only because my mother is a Kibe, educated in Japan. So when I was placed in the San Francisco General Hospital, I couldn't communicate. Of course, back in those days, they didn't have bilingual staff. So I was placed in a crib by the second-story window. And I remember looking down at the bird bath, and that was my entertainment for the day because I couldn't communicate, and I was very much lonely, missing my family. But unbeknownst to me, while I was in the hospital for 6 weeks, I had these, like I said, I had these earaches, chronic earaches. And luckily they didn't do any surgery because in those days they chiseled through the back of your ear and left a terrible scar. So anyway, after 6 weeks, I was looking out the window and I saw my father followed by two it turns out to be FBI agents. So I jumped out of bed and then got my clothes, and I got into a car that had a white star on the door. It was an army car. And I was transported to Tanforan Race Track, where the Japanese were imprisoned. And I didn't know any of this had gone on, and to this day I've never been back to our house in San Francisco, Japantown. But after 9 months of Tanforan, and this is kind of funny, as a kid, you love to see horses because you seldom ever see any livestock in Japantown or San Francisco. So for all those 6 months or 9 months we were there, I was constantly looking for a horse. But the horses were gone, so the only thing left was a lot of horse manure and smell of, the barns. It was, I didn't know what was going on. I was only 4 years old at the time. But I remember my mother's face and how worried she looked. She couldn't speak English because she was educated in Japan. And it was very traumatic for me because I knew my mother was scared to death. And it turns out my mother was frightened that being that she was educated in Japan, she thought she was going to be separated from her 5 children. So that was a constant worry for her. We were transferred to Topaz, Utah. And again, that was very traumatic for us. I mean, I was a kid. I learned to make our own fun. There were no swings or slides for kids to play on. So we did whatever we had to do to entertain ourselves. And mostly it was playing marbles in the sand. And the extreme weather condition from San Francisco, my 2 older sisters came down with severe cases of asthma, and so we were transferred from the southern western corner of our camp to the first row of barracks, which was right across from the hospital because they thought they would be needing medical care, etc. And it was kind of, I learned this recently, that my mother separated from our father between Tanforan and Topaz. So there were no male in our family to take us to the men's latrine. So my 2 older sisters and me and my 2 younger brothers were taken to the women's latrine. And after a while, the women started to complain because they didn't want these boys in the women's latrine. So I had to grow up, on my own at the age of, I turned 5 in Topaz, and that was the end of 1942. it was, like I said, I had fun because I was a kid. And then we did what we had to do. We played marbles, like I said. We crawled through the barbed wire fence later on because the security had dropped and the guards weren't in the guard towers during the day anymore. And I remember climbing up into the guard tower, and this older guy, Arthur, said, "Toru, pick up that phone and swear at the MPs at the other end of the line." And I just knew very few words in those days, but I did. And the block was, our camp was 1 mile square, and there were guard towers at the corners and one in between. So half a mile from the middle guard tower where we were, we would see a Jeep coming in a cloud of dust. And we would scamper down the stairs and crawl back into the barbed wire fencing and run like hell. And we had a lot of fun that way. You know, it was adventurous, and we didn't know any better. You know, when I went to the first grade in Topaz, and I went there not knowing a word of English. And I had to learn English and say the Pledge of Allegiance to a flag that was by the door. And I didn't know what I was saying. You know, I didn't know what liberty and justice for all meant. But I said it because we were told to do that. But when I grew up, I really became resentful that here I was, a prisoner in my own country, treated like a foreigner. And there's a part of me that's still very bitter to this day because the pain is still there, and those memories of being treated like we were, my mother, my family, suffering all the indignation of the climate change, the conditions. I mean, looking at the world through barbed wire fencing, although there wasn't much to see out in the middle of the desert. We were 17 miles out of this little town of Delta. But it was a hell of a way to grow up. It was, to me, a horrible way to, begin your life. You know, I went to the first grade, second grade, third grade in camp. And when the war ended, the government took us back to San Francisco, but we couldn't occupy Japantown because it was already occupied by African Americans who took over because they had no place to go. So the government put us into the temporary housing project for the shipyard workers. And the remaining shipyard workers who we didn't displace, saw us as the enemy that their parents were fighting and building these ships for. So I grew up hating myself for being a slant-eyed yellow Jap, and that's what they called us. And I was called a dirty Jap, and I was blamed for Pearl Harbor and all the death that these people, fathers and uncles, suffered. It was a time not to be. It wasn't fashionable to be Japanese in those days. Today is different. People come up to me and ask me if I know of a good sushi bar. But back in those days, everything we did, everything we ate was a source of embarrassment and humiliation. And I remember kids coming up to me, these white kids in grammar school and high school, junior high school. They would say, "Hey, Toru, is it true that you guys eat rice balls?" And I didn't know what they were talking about. We don't call them rice balls, we call them nigiri and sushi. But to them, it was, it was something that was it was humiliating and dehumanizing. And we were always the ridicule, with the brunt of the jokes. And growing up, and in those days, the toys that came from Japan were very cheaply made. And, we associated anything that came from Japan as a piece of junk and something to be embarrassed about. So it's a hell of a lot different than it is today. Most of us drive Japanese cars. We watch Japanese TV. We use Japanese cell phones. We have Japanese computers. It's okay to be Japanese today, but in those days, it was something to be ashamed of. And I remember many times praying to God that I could wake up in the morning being blonde and blue-eyed, so all this torment and embarrassment, humiliation would go away. But I guess God was in a meeting and too busy or something. He never answered my prayers. But I learned from a lot of pain and a lot of therapy. I learned, it's not too bad being what I am. I can't help it. I can't do anything to change it. So thank God I had a good psychologist, Dr. Ron Abraham, who essentially told me that no matter what people do or say about you, it doesn't necessarily lower your value as a human being one iota. And I've been repeating that to myself like a mantra. It's almost like trying to convince myself it's okay to be Japanese. It's okay to come from a heritage that honors the elderly. We honor education. Japanese are good citizens. You seldom ever. I worked in 3 county jails. I never had a Japanese prisoner. Never. And we abide the rules, and we abide all laws. We pay our taxes, we work hard, we educate ourselves, and we try to be good neighbors to whomever we're living next to and whoever we work with. So, I'm learning more and more. There's nothing to be ashamed of to be Japanese anymore. But right after the war, it was the worst thing that I could have done, I could have been. Or even in grammar school, I remember being the only Japanese kid in the class. And I remember Valentine's Day. I never heard of Valentine's Day before. And the kids would buy and send or give Valentine's cards to the popular girls in the class. And there were always these pretty, cute little Caucasian girls. And no one ever gave me a card. Nobody ever valued me as a valuable student. Even if I got good grades, it didn't matter. So, I grew up with very poor social skills. Other kids went to the school dances, or they were invited to parties, and I never went to a party, never was invited. Never danced with a girl, never held a girl's hand. Of course, I had crushes on girls like any other red-blooded American boy, but I could never go to the movie, never had a date, blah, blah, blah. So it was always demeaning and dehumanizing to be what I was, and I still have a lot of pain. It hurts me to this day to even think back on how tough things were back in those days. And I guess that feeds into some of the anger and the resentment and the hostility and the depression that I had these bouts of depression, and anybody could understand why. I remember when I first came out of camp and I was in the 3rd grade. I was in the 3rd grade, I think. And I was sitting in the back of the class had already started. School started already. And I was one of the latecomers to the semester, and I was sitting in the back of the class on the left side row, and these 2 boys and a girl turned around and called me a dirty Jap. So I went crying to the teacher, and I told the teacher that those kids back there are calling me a dirty Jap, and the teacher looked down at me and she said, "Well, you are, aren't you?" And it was like a dagger in my heart. And I didn't know what to do. If the teacher even agrees with these kids, what chance do I have to have a decent education and concentrate on my studies, etc.? So those are the bad examples. Being spit on, being called dirty names, being chased and thrown rocks at, etc. I can't think of any good examples of somebody who stood up for me. I really can't. I can't think of anybody. My mind goes blank. I'm sure if it happened, I'd remember, but I can't ever remember somebody who took my side and said, go easy on those kids. They're not so bad. I can't think of anybody. If there's a bright side to all this, it is that as an adult, I learned to appreciate kindness and love from my friends and my acquaintances, and that's been, I think, if there's any salvation in my life, it's got to be the good friends that I made as an adult, because I've said it a million times that all the pain I suffered as a pre-adult, my adult life is more than overbalanced, outweighed the negatives I had in my my formative years. So, I have a lot to be thankful for. That's for sure. But I suffer from a lot of depression, a lot of anger, a lot of hostility. I have a lot of rage inside. I have a lot of anxiety. I have a lot of indecision. Thinking in retrospect, my mother, who's 105 today, still alive and well, my mother has always been the comedian. And I think, to answer the question, it was our ability to laugh at ourselves or laugh at our situation that has been the salvation for at least my sanity, of what I have left. It's true that, when you can laugh at yourself, it's the best medicine. Because, sometimes we take ourselves too seriously. We have a tendency to over-exaggerate our problems and our aches and pains. And I learned, as a therapist, that, everybody has their cross to bear, and no one leaves this world without a broken heart at one time or another in their life. And I certainly had my share of broken hearts, I grew up that way. But I think the flip side of it is that when you've had a tough life, you learn to appreciate the good things of life too. So it kind of, balances things off. But it doesn't take away the pain and the suffering that you went through. It's always a part of you. In 1989 was the first time I returned to Topaz. And I've been back over 20 times since. But in 1995, which is 50 years after we left, I was standing in front of our barrack, in front of our front porch. We were in Block 4, Barrack 10, Apartment C and D. And to this day, the framework of our front porch is still in the ground. The top of the porch is gone. But in 1995, I was standing there, and something told me to dig at the lower right-hand corner of our porch. So I took a stone, and I broke the hard crust of the desert floor, and I dug down about 8 inches, and I found 26 marbles that I had left behind under the porch. That was my hiding place. And I can't explain why I dug at that particular spot, but that was my childhood gems that I had buried there under the porch, and we left in a hurry. I didn't have time to gather everything I had, but I had those memories of camp, and it's some kind of a consolation, I guess, in some ways, that we weren't completely destroyed by our experience, but playing marbles, going for hikes out in the desert was a form of recreation and fun for us. I had fun as a kid in many ways in Topaz, but because I didn't know why we were there or what we were doing there. I didn't know our rights were being violated. I didn't know anything. I was just a kid of 4 years old to almost 8 when we left. So, you know, I did what most kids do. They make fun. We learn to make our own fun, and somehow I made it through, I guess. In camp, I never had a birthday party. I don't know. I don't remember any Christmases. We never got any gifts. No, I can't remember any holidays that were any special than any other. I can't remember any Thanksgiving dinner that was different from what we already had. I'm sure there was some sort of celebration, but I don't have any recollection of those. No particular day in camp stands out in my mind. We were one of the last to leave because we had no place to go, and the government was forced to find a place for us, and so our Topaz closed on Halloween Day, October 31st, 1945, and we were one of the last buses to leave Topaz. And I remember my mother said we have to get up real early. We got up at 2 o'clock in the morning. We got fully dressed, and it was October. It was cold. And I don't know if I said this, but my mother had to keep our stove, our coal-burning stove, going all night long, because if the fire ever went out, we were froze to death. It was very, these barracks were very cheaply built. There was no insulation from the hot or the cold. But I remember we got up really early the day we left. We got dressed. We had to put our clothes against the pot-belly stove to warm up our clothes because our clothes were stiff as a board from the cold. We got dressed, and everybody had a little suitcase or a bag to carry. And we all walked out. It was still dark. We walked out of our front porch. We took about a few steps, and we turned around. We all faced the barrack. And I remember my stepfather said, "Goodbye, house." And we all bowed to the house, and we turned and we walked away. We got on a bus, a school bus, and my mother was pregnant with my sister. My mother had her stomach was bulging, and this bus driver was an old white man, saw my mother and told her to lie down on the wooden bench. And I remember my mother's face. She was so embarrassed, but she did what the man told her to do, because you don't dare argue with a white bus driver. And I still remember my mother's face of embarrassment, uncomfortable, lying on a hard wooden bench. And then from there, we're taken to Delta, which is 17 miles. And we boarded a train, and we came back to San Francisco. When we returned to San Francisco, Japantown was occupied by African Americans who were brought up from the south to work in the shipyards. And I guess no one else wanted to live where we lived, so they occupied Japantown. And when we were released, the African Americans could move because nobody wanted to have them as neighbors. So the government was stuck with us, and so they put us into the Hunters Point shipyard workers' temporary quarters, which were dormitories. So each room had 2 single beds and a dresser. So for a family of, at that point, 6 children and mother and father, we were all in separate rooms, and we had to eat across the street at the cafeteria. My stepfather had to look for a job, and because of the prejudice, there were very few jobs available So we had no money, and things looked very bleak because I remember going into a grocery store. We had no money, we were just kids. And I remember the store owner grabbed us by the back of the neck and threw us out and pointed at a sign by the door. It said, "No Japs allowed." And so, you know, we weren't welcome back home. And then I went to grammar school in San Francisco for that about roughly 9 months. And we were always the minority. And, you know, the kids seemed to know that we were, you know, Japanese and just released from the camps. And so, you know, when you're identified as prisoners of war, I mean, they don't look kindly to you. And we were always feeling, I always had this feeling of guilt, you know, of something I never did. And I mean, I was just a kid, but growing up with this feeling of guilt all the time really takes a toll on your psyche. You know, you feel ashamed and guilty for what? You're just feeling that way all the time. You feel super sensitive to criticism. We were always criticizing ourselves. And there was this humongous degree of self-hatred among Japanese Americans. You know, we hated what we looked in the mirror, so we saw another face like ours, we hated that person. So our community was really fragmented and talk about this, you know, being dysfunctional. Boy, it was horrible. And to this day, you know, most of my Japanese American friends have very poor social skills because they keep to themselves. They never got over, I guess, you know, the hurdle of not being accepted and being the brunt of a lot of hostility and hatred. I tell kids all the time, you know, the reason why I come to talk to them about my camp experience is to teach them that, you know, you don't have to be Japanese to be discriminated against. There are people whose families don't have a lot of money, or they don't live in the biggest house in town, or they don't wear the best clothes to school, or their fathers may be missing. But I always stress how painful it is to be the brunt of hatred and discrimination. And so my message to all these kids are that to be sensitive to those who are different, who are maybe not as fortunate as you and your parents and your family, to you know, to look in your heart for love for people instead of hatred. You know, it's so easy to hate people, but it takes a little bit more consciousness to have sympathy and love for those who are less fortunate. So that's my message to kids. You know, I mean, I wouldn't want anybody to grow up the way I did, feeling the way I did about myself. And we all, you know, children are not sensitized to these pains because they're just children, but I always remind them that it is painful and it is very destructive to people to, if we discriminate against them, or if we ignore them, if we shun them, if we treat them with indifference, hatred, etc., because we're all human beings. And we all deserve the best, and we deserve all the love and affection that we can get. Well, I said, you know, my friend was Arthur, the older guy who kind of was the leader of our three musketeers. There's Arthur, Bobby, and me. But it's funny, you know, after camp, I never saw him again. I understand he's living in Sacramento. He's a dentist or something. We all go our separate ways, and we never see each other. Even at camp reunions, or most Japanese stay clear of it because, you know, it's not a happy thing it's not a happy high school reunion. It's a reunion of camp prisoners, you know, and of hard times. It's not something that a whole lot of people got over, and I think that's a living testimony that there's lots of people still behind barbed wire fences, you know, and they're the victims of this treatment that we got. I've been to every camp except Poston and Gila River, and you know, every camp is pretty much the same in that, you know, we were prisoners, we lost everything, people suffered, so there's not much difference between one camp to another except for the location and maybe the slight climate change. But one story that really touches me is my friend was in Manzanar. He was a 19-year-old boy, and he and his father, mother, and 2 sisters were imprisoned there. And his younger sister was a deaf mute, and when she died many years later, he took her ashes back to Manzanar, and he said he poured half of the ashes inside the fence and half of the ashes on the outside of the fence to, I guess, to demonstrate that, you know, even her ashes are partly still in the camp and the other half are outside the fence. And I think that's really symbolic of many of us. You know, we're still in camp in a lot of ways. In some ways, it was a refuge, and it was you know, it's like horses. You know, when horses they run back into a burning stable because that's home. And as horrible as the camp was, you know, to me, that's where I grew up, and it's kind of home to me. But it's kind of crazy that you would identify a prison camp as home. But like I said before, there's a part of me that had a lot of fun in camp, and there's a part of me that suffered a lot of damage, a lot of pain and humiliation. And I'm still very angry to this day. I really am. I'm very bitter. A part of me is very bitter of the treatment we got, because I believe in fairness. And when somebody tells me I'm an equal citizen of this country, and yet you treat me like a total different set of standards, that really is upsetting. It creates a lot of anger and rage inside of me, and I still feel very resentful that certain Americans get the best of our country, and then there's people like us that get the other treatment. You know, I was asked to be on a panel years ago in San Francisco by Dr. Satsuki Ina, a local psychologist, and it was an interesting learning experience. I was sitting next to a man who was a few years, maybe he was 5-10 years older than I am, and we were talking about camp, and I mentioned that a friend of mine, an older woman, could think nothing but the positive things from camp. She could think of no negativity of the camp experience. And he said, well, if she can't, if she could only think of the good things, then she shouldn't deserve redress and reparations. You know? So I said, well, since when does the Constitution say if you didn't suffer, your rights weren't violated? You know, and this man got so angry at me. I mean, his rage came out, and I thought we were going to, you know, go to blows. But I reminded him, I said, isn't this interesting? I just met you for the first time a few minutes ago, and you're ready to knock the hell out of me, you know, because your anger and rage is coming out on me, and I'm a fellow prisoner like you were. But most Japanese Americans, we we take out our anger on one another. You know, we can't go out and express our anger to white people because that's not acceptable. But to each other, all this anger and rage comes out, and there's a lot of, like I said before, there's a lot of, you know, poor social skills, there's a lot of anger and rage. It comes out on each other, and even to ourselves. Our book, Making Home from War, was edited by Brian Comey Dempster, professor at the University of San Francisco. And it's a collection of anthologies by 12 Japanese Americans who were in camp, and it's about resettlement. It's about life after camp and how and what we went through to, you know, join mainstream America. You know, the struggles we went through to rent an apartment, rent a house, find a job, find a place in school, to be trying to you know, blend into mainstream America, and the pain and the obstacles we ran into there. So we all wrote, you know, many pieces about what it was to be a Japanese American in an all-white society, and how we were not accepted. It talks about the struggles of trying to restart our life again from nothing. And there's a lot of tears and a lot of sorrow, a lot of sadness in these stories, because they're kind of heart-wrenching stories of wanting to be accepted, wanting to be just like anybody else, and yet, you know, we were the brunt of a lot of hatred, ignorance, and violence. I would like students, I'd like anybody and everybody to be able to understand I guess I would want people to understand what it's like to be singled out and treated with indifference, hostility, anger, and prejudice, because it affects people's lives and for the rest of their life, and it's very damaging. And you know, there's a number of suicides. There's a number of people who went insane because they just couldn't handle all the stress and anxiety, depression, etc. from the treatment we got. So, you know, you're looking at somebody who made it through alive. And outwardly, maybe we might be, quote, normal like anybody else, but inside, I struggle every day with being okay to be Japanese, being okay to be who I am and what I am. And I'm living in constant fear, it seems. I'm always on guard of violence or hatred, acceptance. And it's just a horrible way to live. And it's just something I just can't, I've never been able to shake in my life. I have periods of times when I'm I forget about what it is to be Japanese, but I'm constantly reminded, minute by minute, that I keep telling myself I may be Japanese, but it's something to be proud of, not something to be ashamed of. So I guess to answer the question, I guess I would want people to understand that, you know, there were these people who were discriminated against, who were really good citizens, who came out of the camps and did the right thing. We suffered, but you didn't hear about Japanese Americans becoming mass murderers. You know, we didn't go out and rob banks or burglarize people, harm people, etc. You know, we remained good citizens like we were before we went to camp. So in some ways, you know, we're kind of a success story, but I don't know how many people really feel that in their heart. The one that's the most meaningful to me is called voice lessons, because I'm a singer. I have a band, and I sing songs from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and I talk about the time I went for my first voice lesson, and the voice teacher was this elegant Caucasian woman, and she took me into her study and she asked me, what are your thoughts before you go on stage, Toru? And I said, geez, I was kind of caught off guard, because people said, you go to take voice lessons to learn how to breathe. And I told my friends, I already know how to breathe. But they said, no, when you sing, you have to learn how to breathe. So I went to thinking I'm going to learn how to breathe. And she asks me, what are your thoughts before you go on stage? And I was caught off guard, and I told her the truth. I said, I say to myself, oh, who the hell am I to go up there? I'm just going to make a fool of myself. They're going to say, who the hell does he think he is to go up there and sing? And so she was taken back, and she said, my goodness, how could you perform with all those negative thoughts? And I thought, geez, that's a good question. And I said, well, because all the singers that I know are either white or black. So I had no role models, And so she said, well, if being Japanese is such a burden for you, why don't you pretend you're white? And I felt this big weight lift off of my shoulders. And I thought, wow, geez, if I could pretend I'm white, then I'm okay. So then I can sing. And I could sing without reservation or hesitation, any reservation. So I thought, well, that's a pretty good trick. And so I paid her. And I was walking out of the door, and I thought to myself, well, this may work for a while, but what am I going to do for the rest of my life, Do I have to keep acting or pretending I'm white to be all right? And so I learned from my voice lessons that the most important thing in life is to be able to be who you are and to feel good about who you are, and that you don't have to be somebody else to be okay. So that's one of the stories in the book. I'm kind of paraphrasing things, but it was a good lesson for me. Our struggles to be accepted, are first of all to accept ourselves for what we are, and trying to be accepted by mainstream America and the struggles and the pains that we went for that. And it was a time of a lot of sadness, I have to say. Like I said before, when you don't feel good about who you are and who your parents are, what your culture is all about, etc. You feel like you're coming from a no place, you feel like you're nothing. And then now, today, but after a lot of therapy, I've learned that it's okay to be who I am, and yet it's an everyday struggle to convince myself that it's true. When I graduated from high school, I was one of 5 Japanese American boys that graduated from Cerrito High School in 1956. And we had never danced with a girl. We never held a girl's hand. We never had any romance in our life, unless it was all in the closet or behind closed doors or hidden in some secret place. So after high school, there were these every Japanese community started to have social dancing. So then we all jumped on the bandwagon. We went to different Buddhist churches would have dances, like the Stockton Buddhist Church, the Sacramento, Florin, Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco, San Jose, San Mateo, all up and down the Bay Area. Whenever there was a a dance Saturday night. It was publicized in the Japanese paper. And so we'd all jump in the car, all the boys, and we'd go to Florence, Sacramento, Stockton, Lodi for the dances. And that became the beginning of our social life. But until that time, we were starved socially. We, like I said before, we were really on the sidelines, just envying everybody else that was living a normal American life. But we made up for lost time. We made up for lost time in a hurry. And that was the beginning of a lot of fun for us. But yet, at the same time, with self-hatred, a lot of pettiness, Japanese kids learn to be cliquish, for their own survival. And it was a real difficult time to try to break into some of these cliques. And I feel for people who, there's a number of Japanese Americans who never married. I retired from the Berkeley Mental Health Clinic, and I always envied white people because I always felt, geez, if you were white, you're accepted any place you go in this country or in the world. And I always felt like, God, if I were only white, I wouldn't have the problems I had in my life. And I had one client who would, by American standard, on a scale of 1 to 10, was a 12. She was absolutely gorgeous. And in fact, the other guys in the clinic would come to me and say, Toru, is that your client, that gorgeous blonde? I said, yes. But as gorgeous as she was, she thought that she was losing her hair because her hair was peroxided, this silver color. She thought her jawline was ruined because she had some molar teeth pulled out. And she thought that she wasn't big busted enough. And she admitted she had a real handsome boyfriend. And she admits that she was, wherever she went, guys were attracted to her. And yet here she was, depressed and suicidal. So I thought, maybe there's a God after all. We're all human beings. We all have problems. Even no matter how gorgeous you are, how popular you are, etc., that we all have our problems, and we all have our cross to bear. So in that sense, I learned a valuable lesson that we're all in the same boat in a lot of ways. And it's always easy to think that somebody else has it better than you, but everybody has their problems. And it's a matter of how you deal with your problems that differentiates you from those who fail. So, you hear it in the news every day, famous people with lots of money, lots of fame, they live miserable lives because for whatever reason, they don't find that inner peace inside of them. And so in that sense, I learned a real good lesson that it's true that, we all have our problems. It's not just me.